There's a person at every party who ends up near the wall. Not because they want to leave, they just drift there. They were part of the conversation 20 minutes ago. They had something to say, but the moment passed. They've been turning it over in their head ever since. These aren't shy people. Some of them are perfectly capable of holding a conversation one-on-one. But put them in a group and something shifts. They start watching instead of talking. They notice things nobody else seems to catch. And then, they go home and replay the entire evening in their head. If you've ever stood near the edge of a room, not because you wanted to leave, but because something just pulled you there, you already know what this feels like. Most people assume this is introversion, or low confidence, or just not being a people person. But research in neuroscience has found something more specific going on. And it's not what most people expect. It starts with the amygdala. That's the part of the brain responsible for evaluating threats in the environment. Most people's amygdala activates when something actually dangerous happens. But in some people, this system doesn't wait for danger. It runs constantly, like a security camera that never turns off. Researchers studying brain connectivity have found that in certain individuals, the amygdala's alert system stays active even at rest. Even when nothing threatening is happening, their brain is still scanning, reading the room before they've taken their coat off. Who's tense? Who's faking a laugh? Who just had an argument before they walked in? They don't choose to notice these things. Their brain just does it automatically. And here's the part that nobody talks about. This isn't a malfunction. The brain is doing something genuinely useful, reading social environments with extraordinary precision, but reading a room that carefully takes bandwidth. When most of your processing power is going toward monitoring everyone else's emotional state, there's not much left for actually participating. So, they drift to the edge. Not because they have nothing to say, because their brain is too busy listening to speak. But a brain doesn't wire itself this way for no reason. Something teaches it to scan like that. And what's surprising is how early it usually starts. Some children are naturally more cautious around new situations. Not fearful exactly, cautious. A researcher named Jerome Kagan spent decades studying this at Harvard. He found that roughly 15% of toddlers show a strong pull toward withdrawal when they encounter anything unfamiliar. New people, new environments, new sounds. Their first instinct is to stop, watch, and wait. This isn't shyness. It's a temperament. And on its own, it's not a problem. But what happens next is where it gets interesting. The child hangs back at the birthday party. Nobody pressures them, and nobody even notices. They feel safe. So they hang back again and again. And by the time they're a teenager, disappearing in group settings isn't a decision anymore. It's just what their nervous system does. One study followed children from toddlerhood into their teens and found that about 61% of kids who showed this cautious temperament early on reported social anxiety symptoms as adolescents, compared to 27% of kids who didn't. The pattern reinforces itself. You're sitting in a meeting and you have a thought. You edit it, re-edit it, and the moment passes. Then someone else says essentially the same thing 10 minutes later, and everyone nods. Speaking feels risky, and silence feels safe, even when the evidence says otherwise. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This isn't a flaw. At some point, becoming invisible was genuinely the smartest thing their nervous system could do. It was a strategy, and it worked. The problem isn't the strategy. The problem is that it doesn't update. They're running the same protective software in a boardroom that they learned on a playground 20 years ago. And there's a finding that makes this even more counterintuitive. Researchers found that children with this cautious temperament who also had high self-control were actually more withdrawn, not less. They didn't use their self-regulation to push through the discomfort. They used it to get better at suppressing themselves. But here's where the psychology gets genuinely surprising. The people who disappear in rooms aren't the ones paying the least attention. Research suggests they might be paying the most. Psychologist Elaine Aron has been studying a trait since the early 1990s called sensory processing sensitivity. About 15 to 20% of the population has it, and it's been found in over 100 other species, from fruit flies to primates. So this isn't a quirk. It's a strategy that evolution keeps selecting for. People with this trait don't just feel more, they process more. Their brains take in more sensory and social information, run it through deeper analysis, and produce stronger responses to both good and bad experiences. Brain imaging studies have found that people who score high on this trait show enhanced connectivity in attention and memory networks, even when they're doing nothing. Their brains are doing more work at rest than most people's do when actively engaged. From the outside, they're the quiet one at dinner who barely said 10 words all evening. But you tracked 3 separate conversations. You noticed that two people at the table were uncomfortable. You caught a tension between the host and their partner that nobody else registered. And you'll remember specific details about this evening for years. They're not at the edge of the room because they have nothing to contribute. They're there because their nervous system is taking in so much information that participating and processing at the same time overwhelms the system. They don't withdraw from disinterest. They withdraw from saturation. Biologists describe this as an observe before acting strategy. In every population, human or animal, some individuals jump in first and others watch first. Both strategies survive because both serve a function. Aron's research found two distinct groups of highly sensitive people. A smaller group who had difficult early experiences and carry the trait as a weight, and a larger group who are functionally similar to everyone else, except for the depth of their processing. The trait itself isn't the problem. What happened around it is what determines whether it becomes a strength or a burden. 3 patterns. A brain that scans constantly, a childhood strategy that never updated, and a nervous system wired to absorb everything. They look like 3 different explanations. They're actually one. Disappearing isn't the absence of something. It's the presence of too much. Too much awareness, too much processing, too much sensitivity to what's actually happening in the room. Every pattern described, the scanning, the retreat, the depth of perception, comes from the same place, a nervous system that takes in more than it can comfortably act on. Most people assume the background is where you end up when you have nothing to offer. The psychology suggests the opposite. The background is where the most environmentally attuned people in the room go when the cost of engaging exceeds the cost of watching. Disappearing is not a failure of presence. It's the consequence of excess awareness. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Every room has someone standing at the edge of it who noticed more about the evening than anyone who spoke. They'll go home and replay conversations they didn't join. They'll remember what people were wearing, what someone's voice did when they mentioned their job, the exact moment the energy in the room shifted. Nobody told you that the thing that keeps you at the edge of the room is the same thing that lets you see it more clearly than anyone in the middle of it. That's not a flaw. That's just what it costs to pay that much attention. There's something most people never think about. Every group needs someone who watches. Every conversation has gaps that only the quiet person noticed. Every room has dynamics that the loudest people in it will never see. The world doesn't just belong to the people who fill it with noise. It's also shaped by the people who stand at the edges and understand it more deeply than anyone realizes. History is full of observers who changed things, not by commanding attention, but by seeing what everyone else missed. The people who disappear in the background aren't missing from the room. They're carrying a version of it that nobody else has access to. And there's something quietly powerful about that. Even if nobody ever points it out. Most people won't, but now you know why.